The interview process is meant to filter out the vast majority of people, right? And so you're in a room full of high performers. And what I've noticed is that most people will sort of fly through the levels, but then they will get stuck on a particular level. And when they get stuck, they hit a wall. But when you hit a wall for promotion, whether that's at VP, whether that's at director, whether it's at L7, L6, L5, if you hit that wall, something has to change. There is a blind spot, there's a gap, there might be a skill that you're missing, you might not be able to observe what it is. But what I would do is just get some sort of evaluation. You can do a self-evaluation, you can find somebody else that you might trust to give you some critical feedback. See if you can't find somebody else to sort of like look at, do some sort of evaluation and then tell you what that is. If you're able to do that, then you stand a chance for filling that gap and sort of moving to that next level.
Welcome to the Think Like Amazon podcast. This is your backstage pass into the principles and processes that have powered one of the world's most influential companies. I am Jorge Luis Pando. I'm an 8-year former Amazonian with a passion for helping ambitious professionals grow their careers in a way that's both balanced and sustainable. Each episode, I will talk to leaders to uncover the insights behind their success, and more importantly, how you can apply them to grow your own career. If you're ready to think bigger, move faster, and build a lasting impact, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Right? You're supposed to go to high school and get good grades. You're supposed to go to college. You're supposed to go work for a big company. You're supposed to try to strive and climb this ladder. But if you remove that supposed to and you sort of just examine your life, I think if you haven't done that exercise, it's strictly necessary because you will blink and your life will be essentially over. I'm 42 right now. I turned 21 like yesterday. I still remember the day I turned 21. It was I had a couple of drinks, I'll just say that. And so that was like yesterday for me. And so I think about like I will blink again and then I will be 63, right? And that's where most of my working life probably is over, or at least I'll be getting to the tail end of that. And so you just get this one shot. You get these 3 blinks in your entire life. And it would just be such a shame to not live a life that was sort of true to yourself, where you're trying to please other people, where you're fulfilling everybody else's dream, but you just sort of defer yours because you hadn't really thought about it.
That's super deep. One thing that comes to mind is, as you were saying about the 9 to 5 and being the traditional, and I feel the same way. I mean, good grades at school, good grades or going to grad school, and then joining a big corporation. And we all kind of we do that, at least personally, I can say, because we want to justify all of the effort. So we just put so much effort. It's kind of like a sunk cost fallacy, right? But we put so much effort, and now we need to go in and win the big bucks, right? The other, especially, you mentioned about your Asian heritage. I have a Latin American heritage. We also want to please our parents. There's a lot of that going around. So it's like, my mom is like, what do you do for a living? I explain for like 10 minutes and then she turns around. It's like, my son's a manager. And so there's a lot of that going around. I would argue that in my experience, coaching people who want to leave a big corporation and want to also kind of do this, sometimes being in a big corporation is okay. And your values and what you want to accomplish is, I want to give my kids a good education. I want to give them a good living. I want to travel. I want to do this. I want to do that. And for that, I need money. So I'm trading my time and my value for this money, but it's not money for the sake of just buying fancy things or just storing it, but it's money because I want to give or I have these values very clear and I need money to fulfill them, right?
Yeah, so maybe you can transition to the second part about how to actually thrive as a content creator or whatever the next phase is. I really like to think about this concept of value. And value doesn't, in a business sense, that's going to be like, how do we always go back to this unit of dollars or currency or whatever it is. But I think if you think about value in terms of the abstract, it's like useful for somebody. And so when you work in a corporate environment, value that they give to you in terms of the RSUs or what your salary is, and then you give them value in the form of the work that you do. But there's other value that you can extract from a big corporate entity like Amazon. We had talked about the fact that I can go and download all of the source code or take a look at all of the wikis. There's a sort of internal YouTube. There's all these trainings. And so there is a lot of useful and valuable information inside of Amazon. There's also a lot of value in working with people that are generally talented, and you can learn a ton of things. And so I think of that knowledge and those skills and the up-leveling as part of my compensation as well. And so I think a lot about like, hey, you don't have to go and create content. It's totally fine to sort of work at corporate for your entire life. Are you extracting the value from this place? Or are you just sort of like a leaf on a placid pond and then you kind of just go where the current takes you? I think that sort of inertia or just being caught up by everything that's outside of you, that's the thing that I think you want to avoid. In terms of content creation and how I sort of think about it, it just goes back to that value, right? So if any of you want to sort of like make YouTube videos, if you want to make content on LinkedIn, if you want to grow your brand, but even if you don't want to do that content creation stuff, if you want to do a side project, always think about value. Right. And so the way that I think about my content is you can fall into this trap of, I want to be famous, millions of views, I want all of this stuff. But really, to get popular, to get big, you have to be in a giving mindset. What can I say that would be valuable to the person that might read it? If you do that, if that's your first principle, if that's the principle that you're building on top of, you will always succeed. Right? If you're thinking about, oh, well, how much is this email going to make me in terms of monthly recurring revenue? Then it leads you down this weird path where you're trying to squeeze as much out of this lemon, and then the lemon is no longer giving you any juice. And then you're just like, well, how can we just zap even more out of this thing? Right? I think giving value turns the business that you might create into something other than a zero-sum game. I think that people can up-level and upskill themselves without taking away from others. You can give value, and so the absolute amount of value that's sort of created in the world can also increase without sort of taking away from other folks. So that's how I built my business, is just like, what are the things that I could say that are valuable? If you switch that question onto the second order thing, well, it's just like, well, what do you know that's valuable? Now you're thinking along the right terms.
One of the values that I have, or one of the things that I've recently adopted, is that I used to consume a lot of content, but now I'm in the mindset of like, okay, how do I share that content with others or make them join my ride? And the other is like, how do I make this actionable? So as we're thinking, let's maybe brainstorm here together. But okay, let's say you're listening to this podcast, you're already a few minutes in, and you're like, okay, I'm sold. Like, I need this. I need to do this. But I first need to know my values. I need to know my principles. How can we start doing kind of like a step, or how would you recommend somebody doing like a step-by-step actionable thing? Like, okay, sit down and do this, and then go do that. Like, how would you think about that?
I will tell you, I'll answer your question, but I'll start with how not to do it.
Oh, that's great.
There's this, it's called the curse of knowledge. And it's this idea that once you've learned something, it immediately becomes trivial. Right? So it might actually be like this sort of complicated thing that took you a long time to understand, and then you learn it, and then from that point on, it's just not impressive. And this happens for any type of knowledge. Right? It can be the most complicated thing in the world, and then you learn it, and then you think it's trivial. Now, this happens with patents. This happens with math. I think back to a multivariable calculus and partial differential equations class where I just didn't get it, and then it clicked, and then I'm like, it's trivial, it's simple, and that's happening right now. You have to make an assumption that there is some really valuable stuff that's locked up in your head. It's not impressive to you because you already know it. And so, well, how do I turn this around? You have to think about what it was like when you didn't know a thing. This exercise is so difficult. Right? But you see it all the time, say on YouTube. I'll look at people that are like, hey, this is how I got into Amazon, or this is how I cracked the tech interview to get into Google. And they're basically straight out of school. And part of me, as a former principal engineer, I'm like, oh, that's cute. The amount of views that they have, I'm like, whoa, that thing has like 3 million views. And then I look at the underlying content, I'm like, that's nothing. That's not impressive. But the reason that worked is because they didn't forget how hard it was way back when, because they had this sort of like external validation around like getting a job. They knew that getting into Google was hard, and so they created a video about how to get into Google, and they didn't lose that essence of like, it hadn't worn off yet. Man, that was really, really difficult. And so, okay, well, I'm going to talk to somebody that's 1 step behind, 2 steps behind. And so if you're wanting to get into the content game, I think the best exercise to do is to just think about a younger version of yourself. So I like to think about the 3-year-old me. That was my first day, I joined Amazon and I was 23 years old. I think about that first day. And I think about like what thing, if I could whisper into that person's ear, and if they would listen to me, I was kind of a shithead. I was kind of a jerk when I was 23. But what thing could I whisper in their ear? Not stock picks, not go buy crypto, none of the money stuff, but like what piece of advice that I could tell them about life, about workplace, that if they knew it, would just make your life that much better. That's going to be different for everybody. But that's who you should be talking to. And that's how, so I would tell them really valuable things for that particular person. And the wonderful thing about that is that you don't have to go to user groups or focus groups or anything like that to see if it's a good idea. You know it would be good because that was your life. And so, I think of a 23-year-old me, I think of a 33-year-old me, I think of a 41-year-old me, so that would be last year. And I think just like what would be really helpful. Now, there is a little bit of a trap here, which is some lessons, you need to make the mistake before you learn it, right? I can tell you that the stovetop is really hot, but you know that the stovetop is really hot when you burn yourself. You learn that lesson really quick, right? But you kind of have to, people can just tell you that over and over again, but I'm different, but then when you actually learn that lesson, it really gets there. So some lessons, are very difficult to compress. You should work out. Everybody should work. Everybody knows they should work out and sort of keep up their body and be healthy. But until you get like a health scare, potentially you have an injury, potentially some sort of chronic condition. Maybe your doctor says like, hey, if you don't turn this around, you won't live as long. When that happens, then yeah, you really learn that lesson. And so there are these types of, advice that you really can't, it's not going to make that much of a difference. But there's a very, very large amount of lessons you can just fast forward people on. They don't need to go down this dead end and waste 3 years of their life to know that, yeah, if your team is toxic and your manager isn't very good and you have the option of moving teams, you just should. That would have saved me 3 years of heartache. Okay, cool. I'll just listen to Steve, right? Like that's just objectively better. You don't have to stew and learn this lesson on your own.
So interesting. And I go back to when we first met, you shared a couple of videos with me that helped you as well. So you were doing exactly what you're saying right now. And one of those videos talked about how really all of this game of content creation is you in whatever shape or form have gone from a point A to a point B. And you've built a bridge. Whatever that bridge is or whatever that point B or that point A were, that's exactly that. And there's somebody right now standing inside of point A that needs that information. Right? And I used to think okay, going back to the normal trying to please our parents type of thing, I'll have good grades, I'll go to these good companies, I'll be a CEO, and then I'll retire, and then I'll go back and share all my learnings, right? But I think in today's day and age, and going back to your topic about creating content for your younger selves, that's kind of outdated. Because before it used to be very few scenarios where you can go and give that message. And so you did need to wait until you were retired basically, because otherwise you wouldn't get that spot. But nowadays, everybody has a camera, everybody has a microphone, everybody has the option of just be doing exactly that, but in smaller year cycles, right? Talking to your 23-year-old self when you're 28, and then to the 28-year-old when you're 35 or whatever. And you can always be doing that throughout your career. And that gives this sense of purpose, right?
Now, what I will say is that you might think, okay, well, somebody has said this valuable lesson in a better way than I could ever possibly do myself. And so that might discourage you. Why wouldn't they just listen to that person instead of me? And what I would say to that is there's so much content that's out there, especially with AI. We're drowning in content. We're not thirsting for content. We're not in a content desert. We're drowning in it. And so that actually means that two things. One, really good content is that much more valuable, right? Now we actually need better filters. And because of that, because so much is getting filtered out, you can actually say the same thing. If you take the Venn diagram, there's going to be the people that don't know about you and that have read that content, and the people that have seen the content from both people that have expressed it, but that one side of that Venn diagram where you are the only person that's talking about that thing in a useful way, that that part of that Venn diagram is absolutely gigantic. There's, I think, 8 billion people in the world. That might be outdated by the time you listen to it, and it might be 9 or 10. But there's 8 billion people in the world. And if we want to take a look at software development, there's 25 million software developers. And that number is getting bigger. And I think it's going to get larger as people that don't know how to code, like, I don't think that it's shrinking. And so these numbers are absolutely gigantic. If there was a country with 25 million people in it, that's not a small country. That's like a reasonably sized country. That doesn't fit inside of an entire stadium, right? And so you get better at content by making content, and you just need to not worry about repeating yourself or sort of saying that there are other resources that are out there that are better than mine. Because you are actually providing some amount of coverage that those other sources cannot. You are going to be able to reach them. The last thing I'll say is you might get disappointed. You spend all of this time creating content and you throw it out there. Even when I hit the publish button on a video, you get a little bit of nervousness, a little bit of adrenaline, and you want to succeed, but you might publish something and, 20 people might watch your video, right? Or, maybe you post something on LinkedIn and you got 7 likes. Well, to get 7 likes, I don't like every post that I see. Mm-hmm. You probably had something on the order of like 100 impressions, something like that. That would be a reasonable like to impression ratio. Or if you have 20 views on YouTube, if you were to stand up in front of a group of 20 people or a group of 100 people, you would get nervous. You'd be like, that's a lot of people, right? But for some reason on the internet, like big numbers don't impress you anymore. Oh, it didn't get 1 million views, right? It only got 2,000 views. 2,000 people is so many people to talk in front of. And so, I think reframing success not to be like, hey, how many people ultimately consumed my content or saw my content, but reframing success to be like, is this valuable? Is it made to the quality level that I can make it at? Because, just like you can repeat other people's stuff, right? It doesn't have to be these mutually exclusive islands of content. You can also repeat yourself. And so, if I made 10 videos all on the same topic, right? A very small sliver of folks are going to be like, Steve, have you run out of things to say? But I guarantee you, for each one of those videos, 50%, 60%, 70% of the people that watch that video have never seen any of the things that I had created. And so if you can just sort of ignore the people that are haters on the internet, it's actually really difficult. You can actually reach a ton of folks, like an obscene amount of folks if it was in real life. But on the internet, you sort of think it's a small amount.
That's super insightful. And as I go back to the probably 2 questions ago when we started this new thread with if we want to make this actionable, right? I'm guessing the first step is sit down and know your values and know your principles, right? There's this famous Maslow, the pyramid of needs, right? Mm-hmm. And there's this really great article about how before dying, Maslow created a new peak, but nobody paid attention. And the top of the traditional peak that we all know about is how we can kind of self-evolve into this self-actualization. Thank you. And that's the peak that and if you Google, that's the peak that you'll get, right? But there's this article, and there's various articles on the forgotten peak, and he calls it self-transcendence. Mm-hmm. So it's almost scientifically proved at this point that to find this purpose for your life, you need to go beyond yourself. And that can be in a lot of shape and forms, right? We've talked about creating content. Some of the listeners would never even dare to what do I need to go into YouTube or create that's too much, right? I'm not cut for that, quote unquote. But still, there's so many other ways how people can get to that, right? I would say, the first step is sitting down and knowing your values, knowing what you want to accomplish, right? Because otherwise, jumping all the way to helping others when you're kind of not reach your own self-actualization self, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So self-actualization first. How do you get there? Think about your values, think about your principles. And maybe I'm recapping here a little bit, but not all 9-to-5s are evil and you need to quit. Not all content creation or fun, doing my passion is really that wonderful. The grass kind of is always going to look greener on the other side. But then once you sit down, look at your values, make a plan of how you're going to reach to them and get to this self-actualization phase, then it goes into how do you then contribute to others? How do you then go beyond yourself? If you're not into YouTube or doing LinkedIn posts, I can think of a million ways how you can be a mentor for Boys and Girls Club, how you can be the message that I want to share here, I've struggled through creating content. I mean, before doing this, I didn't even have a social media or anything. And I'm still struggling, quote unquote, because like I'm not getting the views that I would want it. But I think to that point it's never going to be enough. But not everybody should be necessarily doing this. If it's something that you want to work towards, to your point, it makes a ton of sense. 2,000 people is a lot. You probably in real life are not going to get that soon, at least, or early. But then if it's not your thing, not your vibe or whatever, there's just so many other things how you can give back. And some people sometimes forget that even with our kids or even with our direct reports at work, we have like so much influence and so much mentoring that we could be doing. I want to pivot a little bit into rapid fire.
Okay.
So we've been talking about thinking big. We've been talking about writing. We've been talking about thinking big for your career. Principles thinking. You said at the beginning of this conversation, well, are we at 12, 14, 16 leadership principles? You're the leadership principle. I mean, you've worked at Amazon for 18 years. What do you think is missing from the current leadership principles?
Well, I'll just turn that around and say probably the last two leadership principles are too many.
Okay.
So, I think they're like strive to be the world's best employer, and I don't even know.
Something about sustainability.
Oh, yeah. I think, there's making them better by addition, and then I think there's making them better by keeping them the same or removing. Ultimately, I think the last two feel a little tacked on, and, the jury's still out about whether the company is actually embodying those principles. I don't think much is missing. I think, what's the right amount of like laws that could be written by government? You can think about, hey, is there a law missing? Or is there some like antiquated stuff, that could be taken away? I think that there's adequate coverage. And so maybe that's a non-answer. I think that you can definitely do a little bit more by further refining some of the principles that are already there. What comes to mind is like frugality. Okay, well, I think that's awesome. We should be frugal. If you think like an owner, you want to cut costs, and those costs get passed back to shareholders. And if you're a shareholder because of the compensation structure, that's just generally better, right? And there's a principle around waste there. But there's also this concept of like being frugid, where you're not giving software developers the equipment that they need to go and write code. And so that sort of stuff just ends up costing more money because you've railroaded yourself into this sort of like binary way of thinking. I think a lot about door desks, right? So everybody's desk is made out of a door. It's really scrappy and awesome, right? It was built in 95. I know one of my neighbors is one of the first 5 people at Amazon. So he helped buy some of the materials for the door desk. They actually cost more than a regular desk now. Like times have changed, right? Now it's a symbol of frugality, so the spirit of the leadership principle is there. But in terms of practice, it's just like, just don't be stupid about these sort of things.
It's so interesting. It's like people buying clothes that look worn, but they're really more expensive. That all kind of like torn apart. You're the English major turned innovator. Writing is one of your superpowers. Give a couple of tips to our audience. Like, what is that question that you shouldn't miss out of an innovation PRFAQ document, or what are those things that need to be there present as you're writing?
Yeah, there's a ton there. And this is supposed to be rapid fire, but if I were to give
maybe rapid fire was the wrong term.
Yeah.
Miscellaneous. Let's call it miscellaneous questions.
This is the etc. No, what I would say, if you want a piece of advice, is, especially if you're thinking about PRFAQs, don't think about the answer to the questions. Think about the questions themselves, right? So if you could actually come up with like really awesome questions, I think of it as like a pickaxe as you're mining. You're trying to find gold. Questions are the pickaxe. And so when you're drafting a document, any document, but especially something called a press release frequently asked questions, you want the questions to be amazing. Because like any document, you're going to revise it. And so if, say, your VP or your director doesn't like the answer to a question, well, that's simple. You can just change the answer. But the framing of the document is around questions. And so just put a little bit more effort into the questions that you're trying to answer within a document, maybe a little bit more than trying to find the absolute perfect word for, the answer.
That's interesting. Thinking about the question first. Okay, and again, another question that's probably, I'm now regretting calling it rapid fire.
It's okay.
You've publicly mentioned a lot of times, and I've seen your videos, by the way, and some of them do repeat on some topics, I guess, but it's okay because you need to repeat and you need to kind of like talk about one of the greatest cues about a great leader is how they repeat themselves all the time. You've talked several times about going to level 4, level 5, level 6, and that being pretty straightforward in a few years, and then you're really struggling with that last level 7. And for the audience here, that's on a technical angle. So a level 7 on a technical angle is difficult. So getting to principal engineer. Some of our audience is tech, some of our audience is not tech, some of our audience even aspires to just get into Amazon. But once they get into Amazon or any type of company, what are your tips about, and you also host a lot of coaching about promotions. What is maybe this is not so rapid of a fire, but what are some of your tips around getting to that promotion that looks sort of like unattainable?
So there's two questions sort of embedded in that. One is about the rate of promotion and how do you get sort of unstuck? And then there's some tactical bits that are there. I think the strategic bit is a little bit more pertinent. So basically, everybody that works in tech, everybody that works in big tech, right? So tech and non-tech roles, generally they're right shifted, right? So you went to a pretty good business school, right? You made it out of Peru.
You're making it sound like I wanted to flee.
No, I'm just saying, like, if you take the average Peruvian, they don't go to school in the U.S. They don't go to a really big school. That's, yeah. And so, the interview process is meant to filter out the vast majority of people, right? And so you're in a room full of high performers. And what I've noticed is that most people will sort of fly through the levels, but then they will get stuck on a particular level. And when they get stuck, they hit a wall. And it doesn't matter what level that is. For me, it was 7. To get from 6 to 7 took me 8 years. From 4 to 6 took me 3.5 years, something like that, right? For other people, they'll get stuck at 6, right? Or 5, or wherever it is. But the point is that you kind of like the stuff that's easy for you, I'll put easy in scare quotes, the stuff that's easy for you is going to be easy for you. But in a high performance situation where there's a lot of graduation in terms of levels, you're going to hit a wall. And when you hit that wall, it's not like you slow down, it's that you slammed into it and you can no longer make progress. And so what I would say is if you're trying to get promoted, sort of recognize whether you're gliding through the levels, and it's relatively easy. The analogy I'll make is, sometimes people do really well in high school and then they go to college and they have to study now. And, their behavior has to change. And so if you're gliding through, if you're in that high school phase, just continue to glide. You do you. Like, it's working. Just continue to do it. But when you hit a wall for promotion, whether that's at VP, whether that's at director, whether it's at L7, L6, L5, if you hit that wall, something has to change. There is a blind spot. There is a gap. There might be a skill that you're missing. You might not be able to observe what it is. But what I would do is just get some sort of evaluation. You can do a self-evaluation. You can find somebody else that you might trust to give you some critical feedback. But there is something that you're missing, and it's not impossible for you to overcome it. It's just that if it's a blind spot and you can't see the thing, you're never going to get out of whatever hole that you're in. And so, generally speaking, I would say try to find somebody that can sort of see what the issue is. The thing about egocentric bias, right? The thing about blind spots is that they're so easy to see from the third-party perspective. So suppose somebody's a bad communicator. Maybe they ramble a lot or they don't get to the point or whatever. For the person that's a bad communicator, they don't get it. But it's so easy to see when somebody else is rambling. So, I think leveraging that dynamic is super important when you do get stuck. See if you can't find somebody else to sort of like look at, do some sort of evaluation and then tell you what that is. If you're able to do that, then you stand a chance for filling that gap and sort of moving to that next level.
Peter principle, I think it is when people basically rise to the level of their, but you're kind of like disrupting that Peter principle to a bit. And it's like, yeah, you're probably going to reach that top of your qualifications or existing qualifications. You need self-awareness, you need external points of view, but you need to basically shutter through that.
Yeah, tech and corporate is anti-Peter principle. So typically you won't get promoted to the next level until you're operating at the next level. And so you will be stuck at a particular level and the scope will feel constricting. Because likely you're doing some things really well, but the things that you need to plug up, the things that you need to address, the dynamic that I'm talking about is those will generally be hidden to you.
My last miscellaneous question at this point. Our audience is aspiring Amazonians or existing Amazonians or people who actually left Amazon and want to apply the principles. What is that recommendation that you would have? A few minutes ago, you mentioned how you're inside that company and it's not only the money that you extract, but it's also that knowledge that you can extract. If you have to give this recommendation to your, 18-year ago Amazon self, starting at this new company with so many great things, the media shines light on the negative probably, but there's, admittedly, a lot of really great things. What is that one thing that you would say, well, you will sometime or at some point leave this company and you really want to master or really become proficient on this? Like, what would be your recommendation?
Wow. I think it'll depend on what you do. And so, if I channel my inner software developer, Amazon operates at scale across a vast majority, like a very large swath of different products and different areas. And there are these perennial problems that Amazon solves a specific way, but another company might solve a different way. And so some things that come into mind. How does the recommendation system work at Amazon? How does it work for products? How does it work for videos? How does search work? How does Amazon think about modeling things within their catalog? How does high-scale transaction processing happen inside of Amazon? You want to talk about AWS? How does authentication work within AWS? How does S3 work? How does Dynamo work? The answers to these questions are very big and complicated, but at a high level, if you kind of get a sense of how Amazon does it, that really, really gives you some experience points if you're able to go to a different company. And you don't have to know it at a super deep level, but generally things like, okay, well, we think about collaborative filtering this way. This is the way that we think about relevance. This is the way that we think about ordering systems. I think that type of information, it's available to you. And so it's just a matter of getting curious about it. So follow your curiosity that's there, right? So there's somebody I work with that works at TikTok. I'm like, you don't have to go into the algorithms for the recommendation system, but if you knew at a high level how the recommendations work, that's knowledge you can't just get anywhere else. If you work in a non-tech role, I think there are equivalent things. Yeah.
So be curious. Learn and be curious.
Well, I think curiosity is a really easy motivation. So if you can somehow manufacture curiosity, that typically just requires a reframing of things and just being like, whoa, how does that actually work? That's fuel that will get you super far. If you make it a chore, then you'll just be like, I'd rather do something else. But I do think that being able to harness your curiosity that's a superpower for sure.
That's amazing. Well, Steve, we've known each other for a year now. Let me just say, you're definitely not following a straight path here. You're following exactly where you think you add the most value. And so 18 years as a software developer. And now I'll add all of your socials here at the description of this podcast. I encourage people to follow you and keep doing what you're doing, man. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.